It is Nutrition Symposium. For chairing the session, let me welcome Dr. Ravindra Nevi, Specialist in Internal Medicine, Badr Al-Sama Hospital, Oman. Dr. Abhilash B. Jacob, Chief Endodontist, Director, Omega Dental Clinic, and he is also a Senior Consultant at Dr. Rashid's Diabetes Specialty Center. And Mr. Hari Krishnan, Senior Diabetes Educator, Dr. Rashid's Diabetes Specialty Center. Thank you.
A very good morning to all. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Sabir Rashid and the team for giving me an opportunity to chair this session. Next is Nutrition Symposium. The first talk is on keto diet and other fat diets. Do we really need them? To talk on this, we have an eminent speaker, Ms. Geetu Sanal. She's a Chief Dietitian, Jyoti Dev's Diabetes and Research Center, Secretary, AIAARO Kerala Chapter. She authored several publications, and she's actively involved in diabetes educational programs, and she's a certified diabetes educator and regular speaker of various regional and national forums. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the kind introduction. A very good morning, all of you. At this outset, I would like to thank Sabir sir and team for giving me this opportunity. So in the next couple of minutes, I'll be going through some few of the fad diets and keto diet. What is a fad diet? A fad diet is a diet that is popular for a time, and actually, generally they are they doesn't provide any standard dietary recommendation and often promises unreasonably fast weight loss or non-essential health improvements. So what happens is during a long run, these fad diets won't work, and often they end up with some health issues. So let's see what are the pros and cons of these fad diets. Pros: the patient or the people who are following such diets may be happy because they may be losing, say, 8 or 10 kg per week, quick weight loss. And what happens is they are not aware of the consequences of weight loss. Faster weight loss is often associated with dehydration, bone loss, muscle loss, skin problems, of course, malnutrition, and poor sleep. So there are so much of popular fad diets trending nowadays, and people are running behind such diets for quicker weight reduction, and they are actually not aware, they are not actually understanding about the other downside of these fad diets. So let's see few of the fad diets. The first one is the liquid diet, and the idea of this diet is to cleanse your body and rejuvenate it with liquids like juices, water, and clear soups. It sounds good, but what happens is these types of diets are often deficient in many nutrients which are very important for our body, especially protein. And the people who may follow such diets may feel very weak. And the most important part is these types of diets are very difficult to sustain. Next is the cabbage soup diet. This is a 7-day diet which focuses on having many bowls of cabbage soup along with some fruits and vegetables. So what happens is, the first thing, it is a bland diet, and often the patient or the people following such diets may feel bored and even feel very weak, resulting in poor concentration. So the greatest drawback of such diet is you may feel gassy and bloated all the time. Next is the blood type diet, and this type of diet actually includes and eliminates specific food items as per the blood type, and it often follows a one size fit all concept. And the most important part of this diet is the drawback of this diet is it actually eliminates health promoting foods, and people who are following such diet may feel difficult while eating out, and many people maybe feel healthy despite eating foods that are forbidden for them. So next is the cotton ball diet. This is actually a funny diet because it involves consuming cotton balls dipped in liquids such as fruits and smoothies. So the intention of this type of diet is to make the person's stomach feel full, without gaining weight. So see, there are few people running behind such diets, and they are actually not aware of the potential or the dangerous part hiding in such diets. So these types of diets should be definitely eliminated, and we dietitians advise not to follow such fad diets. So keto diet is one of the most trending weight loss diets nowadays, and it is predominant of high fat diet, that is high fat and low carb with moderate protein intake. So how does this keto diet works? Actually, this is a low fat, low carb diet. So there will be an absence or scarcity of the dietary carbohydrates, and this results in a reduction in insulin levels. And this may lead to a reduction in the lipogenesis and fat accumulation. So what happens is after a few days of fasting or drastically reducing carbohydrate consumption, these glucose reserves become insufficient for the normal fat oxidation and also for supplying glucose to the central nervous system. And what happens is nutritional ketosis sets in. Nutritional ketosis can occur if there is minimal glucose available for our body, and hence the body is forced to break down fat into ketone bodies, and these ketones are used as a source of energy. And this shift in energy source causes weight reduction. And there are so many short-term studies on keto diet, on reducing beneficial effects on reducing weight and reducing the insulin resistance, and thereby reducing the incidence of diabetes or controlling the diabetes, etc. So what happens is these are only short-term studies. There are no long-term studies enlightening on the beneficial effects of such diets. And of course, these types of diets are like other fat diets. Keto diet is often associated with side effects. And the initial side effects of keto diet include brain fog. The patient may feel headache or dizziness, fatigue. Of course, there will be electrolyte imbalance, and there is a skin disease associated with this keto diet. That is a keto rash. It is often seen in neck and arms. So on long run, it has shown that these types of diets may end up with kidney stone, gout, and of course, due to the high intake of fat, especially the saturated fat, there are chances of getting cardiovascular diseases as well. So what we need to think is, do we really need these fat diets? Of course, no. Because these fat diets, we know that will end up with health issues, and we should definitely not follow such diets. So why people are running towards such diets are, all these fat diets will give them a quick response, especially for reducing weight. So the people may be happy, and they are actually not understanding about the health issues or the side effects of such diets in long run. So what we advise is, before starting or before experimenting yourself into a new diet, you should definitely get advice from a qualified dietitian or a doctor. So recently we are seeing many of the other professionals like beauticians or even musicians started preaching diet. So remember, there is no one diet fit for all. So we should tailor make the diet according to your metabolic part, your biochemical parameters, your physical things like height, weight, etc. So you should definitely get advice from a doctor or dietitian before starting a new diet. So what happens is, when we follow a nutritious, well nourished or well balanced diet with appropriate portion sizes and along with exercise, you can definitely achieve the goals without risking your health. So with this, I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you so much for your patient listening.
Thank you very much for your excellent presentation. The topic is open for discussion. Any queries from our faculty members? If there are no queries, we will wind up the section. Once again, congratulations, Ms. Geetu Sanal, for your excellent presentation.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Over to Dr. Abhilash for introducing the next speaker and the topic.
The next session, the next topic of discussion in this nutrition symposium is the role of food labels in diabetes. And the presenter is Ms. Swati Krishnan. She's a consultant dietitian at Alain Medical Center. She's the consultant at Aura Slimming Center, Sharjah, UAE. She's also a certified diabetic educator. Welcome, Ms. Swati Krishnan.
So thank you, Dr. Sabi, for having me here. And let's directly go to the topic. Role of food labels in diabetes. So food labels, like everyone have a habit of checking what's other side of, like when we buy a product or a canned food, everything. So food labels can help you make better decisions about what you eat and how you manage your diabetes. The label breakdowns the amount of calories, carbs, fat, fiber, protein, and vitamins per serving of the food, making it much easier to compare the nutrition of similar products. So I'm just focusing all your topics which comes under the relevance of a diabetic patient and his or her diet. That is nutrition fact label, nutrition claims, that to a few ones, and a brief about ingredient list and names of sugar. So moving to this is a research study, like a study on effect of food label use on diet quality and glycemic control among Latinos. The result shows up that the food label use and diet quality were positive mediators of improved HbA1c level. And also researchers found that people who read labels tend to choose food which is more in dietary needs, that more than their dietary needs and rather than on familiarity. Because we all have a habit of choosing food which is similar to us, not much of us, because we are busy in shopping and we are busy in our day-to-day activities. And also, according to a study published in Public Health Nutrition, those who read products and nutritional informations ate more fiber, less saturated fat, and few carbohydrates and less sugar. And they also had a better control over their caloric intake. So let's see what we can find on a nutrition fact label. This is a sample label for macaroni and cheese, where you can see from the starting serving size, calories from fat is given, and right side a percentage daily value, and nutrition informations about total fat, cholesterol, sodium, total carbs, protein, and a few about vitamins and minerals, and a footnote is given. So let's check in detail what's inside there. So talking about calories first. See, this is a sample label for a banana bread loaf, where you can see the calories are 90, total calories are 90, and calories from fat is 19. And listen, general guideline to calories per serving is, if it is 40 calorie, it is regarded as low. If it is 100, it's moderate, and if it is 400, it's very high. So when we check this label, 90 calories for just one slice of banana bread loaf is pretty much, yeah, fine. But the story changes when you are coming to the next topic, serving. So this banana bread loaf, like see, this serving size is for one slice and serving per container is 6. So this 90 calories is just for one slice. So if you finish it up, all the 6 slices, only the thing is that you are end up having 540 calories, and not only calories, you have to multiply rest all the informations like proteins, carbs, fat, whatever comes under with 6. So a serving size is a standard measurement based on the amount of food typically people have at one time. So we have to pay attention to the serving size, including the number of servings in the package, and compare it to how much you actually eat. And don't confuse this serving size with portion size. So next one is total carbohydrates. Talking about total carbohydrates comes with dietary fiber, sugars. So dietary fiber, we know it's a part of total carb, and fiber does not digest. So we have to subtract it from total carb to get the net carb, that is, which is digestible. So here from this example, it is 11.6, you can see. And we know how important dietary fiber to a diabetic diet, because it slows the post-meal blood sugar rise, suppress appetite, reduce cholesterol level, and promote a weight loss. Talking about sugars. Natural sugars along with added sugars are grouped together. So when you are reading a food label, remember that 4 gram of sugar is 1 teaspoon. So just see here from the example, here for the serving size of 6, it is 18 gram. That is 4.5 teaspoon of sugars are there in just one loaf of banana bread. Since we have came across this sugar, let's discuss some nutrition claims which is commonly seen in the labels, like sugar-free. What is sugar-free? Sugar free means less than 0.5 gram of sugar per serving, and low sugar means less than 5 gram of sugar per serving. Note that we have to always conscious about grams here, and no added sugar. This is very common. That means although there is no sugar is added, there may be natural occurring sugar in the food. This is one example. No sugar added doesn't mean that it is sugar free, because this is a fruit smoothie which I have highlighted that no sugar added, but one serving contained almost about 49 grams of sugar. So read your labels and be aware that no sugar added products still can contain a lot of sugar. Next, coming to fats. Total fats comes with the saturated fats and trans fat. So recommended amount is eat less than 10% calories from saturated fat. And also this fat-free, non-fat, not trans-free is a trending food labels we are seeing in almost all packed foods. So what is fat-free? Less than 0.5 gram of fat per serving is a fat-free. And fat-free doesn't mean it is calorie-free, carbohydrate-free, or preservative-free. And also same goes with not trans fat. Because in no trans fat labeled food, there is less than 0.5 gram of trans fat is there. And if the word partially hydrogenated is in the ingredient list, there are still trace amounts up to a certain level. Coming to sodium and cholesterol, we all know diabetes increases your risk for heart disease, high BP, kidney disease. So why should a salt and cholesterol intake is a priority? So recommended allowance of cholesterol per day is 200 milligram, and again, this coming to the label, like cholesterol free, low sodium, we are quite familiar. So what is cholesterol free? Less than 2 milligram of cholesterol in one serving and low in saturated and trans fat is cholesterol free. And the recommended amount for sodium intake is 2300 milligram per day, both from prepared food and salt shaker. And low sodium means less than 140 milligram per serving. So next, coming to percentage daily value. So what is a DV? Percentage DV. Percentage DVs are based on a 2000 calorie diet, and it means it shows how much a nutrient in a serving of food contributes to a total daily diet. That means the percentage DV can help you determine if a serving of food is high or low in nutrient. And a general guideline to the DV is 5% DV or less of a nutrient per serving is considered low, and 20% DV or more of a nutrient per serving is considered high. So from this example, we can see the saturated fat, sodium, and calcium have about, which is more than 20% is considered high, and added sugars and vitamin D, which is like less than 5% is considered low. Always choose food that are higher in percentage DVs for dietary fiber, vitamin D, calcium, and iron, and lower in percentage DVs for saturated fat, sodium, and sugar. So next, some nutrients are also which are coming without any percentage DVs, like trans fat, sugars, and proteins. This is because there hasn't been established any specific guidelines about how much a person can consume for an optimal health. And I should tell you about a brief on ingredient list. That means the product ingredients are listed by quantity, we know, from highest to lowest amount. And a good thumb rule to scan first three ingredients, as they make up the largest part of what you are eating. So if the first ingredients include refined grains, type of sugar, or hydrogenated oils, then assume that the product is unhealthy. Instead, try choosing foods that like items that have whole food listed as the first three ingredients. And in addition, if the ingredient list is longer than 2 or 3 lines, for sure that is a highly processed food, which is not suitable for any people. And this also I should discuss with, like different names of sugar, because to avoid accidental consumption of a lot of sugar, watch out the following names of sugar in the ingredient list, because this is a very misleading. Because types of sugar, types of syrup, and other added sugars have different names and beautiful pet names, like beet sugar, brown sugar, buttered sugar, cane sugar. Yeah.
Continue, please. Please continue.
Yeah, because some disturbance came in. Sorry. So types, and always watch for these names, because first of all, when you read like a maple syrup, oat syrup, rice bran syrup, we are not like, we won't think that it is a sugar. So this can be very misleading to any people, even the practitioners, or even the diabetic patients, or with any other diseases. And other added sugars have a different names, like barley malt, molasses, cane juice, crystal. So I want to tell you that these all are sugars. So even if it is given in a different name, it has. So I want to conclude with that food label is very important public health tool to promote a balanced diet and manage diabetes, thus enhancing public health. So what you eat is up to you. So read labels and choose wisely. That's why I'm concluding my topic. Thank you, doctor, and thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you, Ms. Swati Krishnan, for that excellent presentation on how to read in between the lines when you read food labels. We'll have doubts at the end of the session. Now we'll move on to the next speaker. Dr. Ravindran, please.
Hello. Yeah, the next topic is spices and herbs, the role as antivirals. To talk on this, we have an eminent speaker, Ms. Subhasri Prashant. She's a consultant and clinical nutritionist at Attugal Devi Institute of Medical Science. She did her MSc Clinical Nutrition and Dietetics from CDC Medical College, Trivandrum. And she's a regular speaker of various visual media, and she's a trained diabetes educator. She received prize for her paper presented at the prestigious PedNutriCon 2017, which is the National Conference of the Nutrition Chapter of Indian Association of Pediatrics. She's the director of NutriYog Plus. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. Sabira Rashid and team for giving me this opportunity. Okay, my topic is about spices and herbs and its antiviral as antivirals. We know that so many viruses are there nowadays, and it can cause diseases from common cold to corona. And we are practicing in our day-to-day life with so many spices and herbs, and which are good to boost our immunity and thereby acting as antivirals. And it is a very vast topic. And so, with it's not possible to and in details. So I am just sharing some slides. Then first is herbs. You all know that about herbs. I don't know is there any introduction need for herbs. Even though I'm just giving some introduction about the herbs. These are leaves and stems from flowers of aromatic plant, fresh or dry, and dried herbs are stronger than fresh, and the plants are grown for their flavor and medicinal values. And then about spices, it's bark and root, seeds or buds from aromatic plant, and is used as flavor and set to foods. And we know that from the early history onwards, the uses of spices and herbs as medicine is there in evidences are there in history. So it's a role in ancient Greek medicine, or also Hippocrates, Charaga and Sushruta are mentioned the role of herbs and spurs in their studies and in their medical practices. And from the 9th century, Arab physicians, then Egyptian, Mesopotamia and Rome, Greece, etc. have their writings of having spices and herbs as their medicinal practice. And from the evidences from Ayurveda, we know that Ayurveda is our traditional medical practices, and the treatments of the herbs and spices in Ayurveda also is there. And in Ayurvedic medicine, spices and herbs are also used to wrapped with betel nuts leaves and chewed after meals to increase the flow of saliva and digestion. And for the dietary practices with dosha, vada, pitta and kapha, there are evidences that they are using most eminent spices for these controlling these diseases. And also, when we move through the nutritional benefits of these herbs and spices, it enhances flavor, and it also improves the organoleptic properties of food. Along with this, it has some flavonoids, and it contains phenolic compounds, sulfur-containing compounds, tannins, alkaloids, phenolics, then vitamins, etc. Then let's move through some of the important or some spices and herbs that we are using in our day-to-day life in our kitchen also. The first one is turmeric, and the eminent property of turmeric is it's a good spice with the immune health and relieve pain and can aid in digestion. And the main active compound in it is curcumin, and it has powerful anti-inflammatory, antiviral and strong antioxidant. And curcumin, here researchers are there for the treatment of cancer too. And when we move to the biological effects of turmeric, it has a vast variety of biological effects like anti-inflammatory, antioxidant activity, then antiviral, antifungal, antibacterial, etc. And around 2000 to 2500 milligram of turmeric produce only 60 to 100 milligram of curcumin, and the dosage is 500 to 1500 milligram of turmeric per day and 500 milligram of curcuminoids per day, but high dose is not recommended. Curcumin is poorly absorbed in bloodstream. Black pepper help to consume with which contain pepperine, a natural substance that enhance the absorption of curcumins. Turmeric does not cause any significant side effects. People can experience stomachache, upset, nausea, etc. But on report that a person who are having taking a high amount of turmeric, more than 1000 milligram twice a daily, experience dangerous abnormal heart rhythm. Next one is ginger and gingerol and cedron are the powerful antioxidant properties that help in medicinal properties and also will help to prevent virus. And along with this, protein, vitamin B6, vitamin C, magnesium, zinc, etc. are there in ginger, which are all helping as immune boosters. And we all know that ginger is highly effective against nausea, reduce muscle pain, anti-inflammatory effect, then major driver in indigestion. And there are studies which shows the it is effective against HRSV. It is a study by ethnopharmacol in 2013. Normally there is not much side effects, but some people experience heartburn, diarrhea, etc. Then moving on to garlic, its allicin is the main immune boosting compound present in garlic. It should be released only by crushed, chewed or sliced. Then allyl isocyanate is another antimicrobial component in garlic. Along with it, vitamin C, vitamin B6, manganese also present in garlic. These are all immunoboosters. And we all know that about the garlic, it's natural antibiotic and it can prevent infections inside and outside the body, and is a potent antibacterial, antiviral, and helps our gums to stay healthy, and is also help against fighting against periodontitis, and it is damage. It helps in aging also. And I already told about told that it can be sliced before we put it in our food. And there are studies which explain the antiviral effect of garlic. And usually garlic does not produce any side effect, but some people experience heartburn, nausea, vomiting, etc. And black pepper, antibacterial property of black pepper, especially it helps to improve the digestive, respiratory, and respiratory tract infection, and act against bacteria that damage dental health. And it reduces inflammation and excess gas with the help of antioxidant capabilities, optimize gastrointestinal action, then control heart rate. The main active antioxidant present in is pepperine and vitamin A, B6, calcium, magnesium, and iron. And studies are there which help to prove that it helps to boost the white blood cells by boosting the immunities. Then moving to cardamom, it is highly rich in polyphenol antioxidants, then calcium, iron, magnesium, phosphorus, potassium, vitamin A, and it reduces inflammations, eliminate pain, manage diabetes, eliminate infections, reduce excess, improve heart health, prevent cancer, then increase the health of eyes and skins. And studies are there which helps, shows the antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, anti-diabetic, antimicrobial properties of the cinnamon. And then about black cumin, the action of volatile oil. It is a hypoglycemic impact, and it has impact in immune system. It has impact in microbial effect, and it acts as anti-inflammatory. And other nutrients present is manganese, copper, iron, and phosphorus. Then you all know about fenugreek and its actions, and mainly nutrient components are vitamin A, B1, B2, C, folic acid, linoleic acid, glycolipids, phospholipids, etc. And it reduces inflammation inside the body. It maintains testosterone, and it promotes milk flow in breastfeeding, and it improves digestive problems, etc. And then about cardamom, it has contained potassium, calcium, iron, magnesium, and phosphorus. And health benefits of cardamom consist of It improves blood circulation and cures urinary disorders, aids weight loss, etc. Then we are moving through or discussing about the importance of spices and herbs as antivirals. I would like to introduce before you a drink which can give you yourself, you can make yourselves in your home with amla and lemon along with the spices in their amount, normal amount. It is a project by Hrudayalaya, Heart Foundation by cardiologist Dr. Jaybalsa and Dr. Mahesh Sukumar and Dr. Mohan Shanai, Dr. Aishwarya Vishak and me also a part of this. And this is how the juice is made, and it is an immune juice which will help to boost our immunity, and main product in it is the curcumin powder, and along with it black pepper, black jeera powder, fenugreek, cinnamon, tulasi leaves, amla, ginger, lemon juice, etc. are used to make the juice. And we all know that every coin has two sides. As such, even though spices and herbs are good to boost our immunity, overdosage may lead to some issues. We know that in a Malayalam says that Adhikamayal Amrudam Visham. So using this in normal amount is healthy. Overdosage will lead to hallucination, vomiting, confusion, etc. Then this side I am ending of my talk. Thank you, Sabir sir and team.
Thank you, Ms. Subhasri Prashant, for your excellent talk. I request Dr. Abhilash to introduce the next speaker and the topic.
This topic is organic food, myth and facts. We have Dr. Krishnaja U, who is Assistant Professor, Department of Community Science, College of Agriculture, Vellaini. She worked as an Assistant Professor at Government Women's College, completed her doctoral degree from Kerala Agricultural University. She is the first rank holder in UG, PG and PhD. I invite Dr. Krishnaja U.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. So by the time we are sharing the slide, I would like to thank Sabir sir for giving me this opportunity, and also I thank Sabir sir, Midila and the whole team for taking such an effort, even at the times of this corona, to bring out such a very valuable and informative sessions, and I wish them a grand success. So the topic given to me is on organic foods, facts and myths. I think because I don't know why they've given me this topic, because maybe I'm from an agricultural background, not agriculture background as such. My subject is food and nutrition, but I'm currently working in Kerala Agriculture University. Maybe because of that, sir has decided to give me a topic on organic foods and facts and myths. So when I went through this topic, what I found out was this: it is not something to be limited to a 10-minute speech. But anyway, I have tried my best to bring out some interesting topics. So whenever the first few slides will be about what is organic foods and what are the conventional. I'm not going to take much time on it because we have a very limited time. But whenever you look at what is the definition of what is an organic food, it generally starts with a negative note. But I wanted to make it a little more on a positive note, that it is a product of farming systems that uses natural and regenerative processes. Regenerative processes, that is like generally crop rotation, animal and plant manuring, mechanical weeding, biological pest control, etc. And what you shouldn't use is that of any toxic chemicals. So next slide, please. So what are the toxic chemicals that you need to avoid when you call, or when do you call a product or a food to be an organic food? That it should be free of pesticides, synthetic fertilizers, sewage sludge, and also genetically modified organisms, and also ionizing radiations. Not only it's not just plants which come under organic foods, there are also organically grown animals too, that they produce meat, poultry, eggs, and dairy products, do not take antibiotics or growth hormones. So it is not just growing alone, processing, and even packaging. Everything which is done organically, only then a product or a food can be called as an organic food. So what is the difference? Main difference between an organic food and a non-organic food is that it should be grown without, everything must be natural in an organic food. There is no chemicals used. That is the main difference between organic and a non-organic or a conventional form of food. So eat organic. So do we really eat something organic, or what are the now coming to the main topic of facts and myths about organic foods? So do they really have some any kind of benefits? Yes, so there are some kinds of benefits like what they say. They contain fewer pesticides. That's very important. They are more fresher. We'll discuss about that. They are better for the environment, and they have more antioxidants. They are heart healthy. They are found to contain conjugated linolenic acids, and they protect from overdoses, and also they are rich in certain nutrients. We'll be discussing about that too, and they are free from genetically modified organisms, and they provide better finance, and again they are more fresher. So this is what is said to be the importance or the benefits of having organic foods. So now let us discuss it critically. Next point, next slide. So this is a study, like this is the first or a fact or it's a myth. It is about us to decide, are organic foods more nutritious? So this was studied in the American Journal of Nutrition. It was like more than 10 years ago, but still it is very relevant. The nutrition-related health effects of organic foods. They just systematically reviewed nearly 90,000 articles, and from that only they got 12 relevant articles, but even from those things they couldn't come to a firm conclusion that these organic foods can be nutritious. And but it is on our side to decide what is called as a nutritious food or a healthy food. So, but there are some studies which has been done in France, which says that the antioxidant effects of tomatoes, which were grown organically, were found to be higher in vitamin C. But however, when they tested that after consumption, the serum levels of vitamin C or the plasma levels were not there was not much significantly different from the conventional grown tomatoes. So the next point is whether these organic foods are safer and healthier. And again, here when we speak about this, this is another fact or a myth which is generally tagged to organic foods. So here also it is a review article. So this says that other than eczema or other kinds of allergic diseases, these organic foods did not provide any kind of health benefits. And also, but the thing, one important thing, what was seen to get it was free from many of the antibiotics and also free from some of the bacteria, especially in E. coli in organically grown animals. So next slide, please. So this is what is the conclusion which they derive from these reviews, that they couldn't come out with a strong evidence that organic foods are significantly more nutritious than conventional foods. But consumption of organic foods might reduce the exposure to pesticide residues and also antibiotic resistant bacteria. Then again, it is our decision to decide what is healthy or what is nutritious. Maybe the organic food doesn't increase any kind of nutrients, but it is definitely free from pesticides. So definitely being free from pesticides itself means it is healthier. So, so the next, so this is also another topic, which is healthier or safer. So this is human health implications of organic foods and organic agriculture. This is also a comprehensive review which had come in environmental health. So what they concluded from this study is that organic food consumption has reduced the risk of allergy, especially eczema. But I don't know like how they support how it can reduce overweight and obesity. I think there needs to be more studies on these parts. And some of the pesticides, definitely they are found to have adverse effects of certain pesticides on children's cognitive development and current levels of exposure. And there were also some of the modestly higher contents of nutrients were found in compounds in organic fruits and vegetables. And one important thing is it was found to be less in the cadmium content, which is cadmium content, which is called as which is considered as a heavy metal. And certain organic fruits or vegetables or foods which were grown are found to be having a higher content of omega-3 fatty acids, but still they are not conclusive. And also it is free from antibiotics, so which is more generally seen higher in the conventional animal productions. So the next point is whether they can lower cancer risk. So the risk, this is a study done in UK, and this article was published in British Journal of Cancer. Nearly 0.6 million of women were taken taken under the study, but still those women who were completely on organic food, they were found to be having some of the kind of cancer, except for Hodgkin lymphoma. Many were found to have breast cancers and other kinds of cancers. And so this is what they UK England, what they say is they live longer, so that's why they have means they have cancer. That's why they have different kinds of cancer. So that is what their conclusion was. So this is a study in America, in US, so Association of Frequency of Organic Food Consumption with Cancer Risk. They said like this was done among 68,000, nearly 69,000 participants. And what they concluded is high organic scores were inversely associated with the overall risk of cancer. So overall risk of cancer was inversely proportional to the higher intake of organic. So this is something positive. So the next is generally there is a general notion that when you go for organic farming or organic kind of food, they will give you a lesser yield. This study was taken in our own university, that is Kerala Agriculture University. So effect of organic and inorganic nutrient sources on the yield of selected tropical vegetables. So they had selected nearly 10 tropical vegetables, and what they found is that the definitely some of the yields of not all crops, but certain crops like amaranthus and other gave a better yield when organic compounds was given as a fertilizer. But what point which is it was comparatively they required a lot of fertilizers. I mean a lot of fertilizers, even if it is organic, more amount of fertilizers when compared to conventional methods was required. Next. So here they said this is an article which came in Letter, that is comparing the yields of organic and conventional agriculture, and there was also no significant difference in the production of organic and conventional agriculture. Next. So organic products, do they taste better than the conventionally grown vegetables? Yeah, this is an Irish study where they have grown some organic fruits and vegetables, but here also there was no significant differences in the taste of the products which are grown organically. But I think there is a point that when we grow something on our own or in our kitchen garden or in our backyard, maybe it tastes better. Maybe we are not using some fertilizers, but there are no studies which proves these organic products can taste better. Next. So what we have to remember is to read our label. So there are some products which in the market which says that it is 100% organic, or it is 75% organic, or it contains organic ingredients. So there are different kinds of labelings which goes with organic. So when we spend more money on organic products, we have to be very sure that we are spending it on the right product. Next. So this is something. This study was done in the pesticide residue laboratory of our College of Agriculture, Valai. They tested many commonly used vegetables and fruits, and this is the results they have come out with. Many of the samples had higher residue levels, pesticide levels.
Dr. Krishna, I think we have to conclude it now. The time is running out.
Next. So means 18 samples were tested, and you can see from the chart that there were samples which are higher than the FSSAI levels. Next. So these are this was done in 2017. Usually we have a 6-month report which comes every year, once in 6 months. You can see this samples were collected throughout different parts of Kerala, and it was tested. So these values are for samples which are collected from the markets directly, and you can see that which have been is also the fruits, especially in grapes and red chili. Next. Red chili powder, which is see that is also having a higher amount than the this is a limited value. Spices, among spices, cardamom, cumin, fennel seeds, they were found to be higher in these pesticide residues. This is a recent report which was done in 5 kinds of where the samples were collected from the public and also from directly from the farmers, and also which compounds which are said to be called as organic. So next. So from that, when those products which are labeled as organic, even they had among the 16 sample tested, 3 numbers were found to be having means those pesticides which are banned by Kerala. Okay, and among them capsicum, this salad cucumber, bitter gourd, those were the most commonly used vegetables. Next. So these are some of the vegetables which are found to be safer from the market. Next. So these are from the directly from the farmers. Next. So these are foods called as organic and they were found to be safer. Next. By Kerala, and luckily we don't have anything which is in the red which have been found in these products. Next. Okay, so it is always for us to decide whether we have to go organic or conventional. It is so I can't. I'm not able to do it completely in this 10 minutes which is given to me. And thank
Doctor, that's fine. Thank you.
And the team for giving me this opportunity. Thank you for taking an extra time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Krishnaja. That was an excellent presentation. Sorry for interrupting you in between.
No problem, sir.
Yeah. Now we'll have the questions at the end of the session, and we'll move on to the next speaker.
Next topic is dietary intervention in the treatment of obesity by Mrs. Soumya Nair. She is a consultant dietitian at ESA Hospital, Erikon, Kollam, former dietitian at SUT Pattam, state convener, Indian Dietetic Association. So, Soumya.
I would like to thank Dr. Shabir Rashid and Dietitian Mithila for inviting me for this webinar. So, my topic is dietary intervention in the treatment of obesity. 1 second. Okay. We all know that BMI is a great indicator of obesity, and WHO has clearly graded the BMI like 25 to 29 kg per meter square is considered as pre-obese and greater than 30 as obese. But due to various reasons like muscle mass loss, BMI is a less accurate predictor for Indian scenario. In the Indian guidelines, it is 18 to 23 is considered as normal and greater than 25 as obese. And in a retrospective study of curve analysis, it was found that the cutoffs corresponding to the percentage total body fat is somewhere between 32 for males and 37 for females. So this is higher than the definition of obesity in terms of body fat, that is 25 should be the body fat in males and 30 in females. So BMI cutoff should not be considered as, should be further reduced to 22 kilogram per meter square in Indians, as we have more risk of diabetes due to various reasons than the white population. So BMI is just a number that is used to evaluate your body size and not the body fat percentage. So as we all know that now the body composition is the main thing we have to check, and the total body fat is the sum of essential fat and stored fat. Essential fat is crucial for normal body functioning, and stored fat which is getting accumulated in adipose tissue. And this is a very much discussed pic depicting thin Indian phenomenon. Mr. Yatnik appears thinner than Mr. Yatkin in picture, but actually carries more percentage of body fat. And we can see that both are the same BMI. So this is how fat becomes the important point. And as we know that fat is a culprit, we are moving to the causes of fat storage. The main and the major cause is imbalance. The energy results from an excessive intake of calories, intake through food and beverages, above the consumption of the body. expenditure is considered as necessary physiological function and physical activity. And when your intake is greater than your expenditure, the excess calories is stored as fat. And this fat is the main causative factor for obesity, which is leading to all the NCDs, as we know. And there is a strong association between the weight gain and diabetes. And as you know that this is why this topic has been discussed here. Diabetes is a new term which is arising, and it is a single greatest contributor to chronic diseases. And it is considered as a 21st century pandemic. And to the nutritional intervention, I would like to share what is weight loss. The Institute of Medicine defines successful term weight loss as at least 5% reduction in initial body weight, and that is maintained for at least 1 year. So this answers the question why diets don't work. So regaining weight among dieters is a norm and not the consumption, and no one can live on a diet forever as we are in daily contact with food. So the key to successful weight loss is making changes in lifestyle patterns and physical activity, which can be followed for a rest of life. And this point is very important. And coming to the phases of treatment of obesity, we have two phases, phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 1 is weight loss and phase 2 is weight loss maintenance. And this weight loss maintenance phase is more important in the treatment, as we can see that when you stop treatment, the disease comes back. The factors affecting the regain of weight may be many and may be similar to the causes of obesity, but when should be here. And the recommendations of medical management of obesity, the clinical workup is a very important one, like the physical examination, height, weight, BMI, etc. And the laboratory test like glucose tolerance test, HbA1c, etc. And combining and getting the data, correct data with the clinical workup is very important. And according to this, we have to plan a individualized hypocaloric diet. Why hypocaloric? Is because diabetes is a disease of adiposity. And physical activity is also recommended, like 60 minutes of physical activity daily or 300 minutes of activity per week. And pharmacotherapy can be used in obese diabetic individuals if needed. And bariatric surgery is indicated in patients with a BMI of greater than 32.5 kilogram per meter square and without any comorbidities. So coming to the nutritional management system in obesity, we have 4 points. Like the first point is nutritional assessment, as we discussed earlier, the diet history, ABCD and fat cell distribution, etc. And according to that, a nutrition intervention strategy has to be planned, which works individually for different persons, because we don't have a diet for everyone. And we have to check what will work in long term. And the third one is realistic goals and not immediate goals. And the fourth one is follow-up and reassessment. And simple and realistic diet modifications have the highest likelihood of success in any dietary interventions. And the management of obesity, yes, the therapeutic lifestyle changes combined with any treatment modality enhances weight loss. And purely coming to the nutrition intervention, as it is an energy imbalance disease, the treatment option comes with energy reduced diet, either low calorie or very low calorie, with or without a meal replacer. The key strategy for weight management that can be applied across dietary patterns is to reduce energy density. And coming to the low-calorie diet is usually between 1000 kilocalories to 1600 kilocalories and never less than 800 calories. So a traditional individualized reduced calorie diet plan is used, or a meal foods and snacks that are vitamin and mineral fortified can be used, or a partial meal replacement plan with both this. And in very low calorie diets, it is rarely used, but it is safe when used as recommended and not intended for a long-term use. Here, the calorie recommendation is less than 800 kilocalories, and it is used commonly in morbidly obese patients or those in whom weight loss is rapid weight loss is essential. So, energy reduced diet with the help of meal replacers, we'll see into it. It can be partial or complete, but usually we recommend partial use of partial meal replacers along with diet recommendations. The key role of meal replacement is to limit food choices and possibly bad food choices. They are usually well structured and measured dietary compositions, and they are aims at controlling portions and high calorie consumption. So a meal replacement therapy is a viable approach for combating overweight and obesity and favorably impacting health outcomes. So the AACC Comprehensive Clinical Guidelines for obesity includes 3 components: meal plan, physical activity, and behavioral changes. So the meal plan includes, as we discussed earlier, the reduced calorie healthy meal plan, which can be either 500 to less option, and individualized diet like Mediterranean, DASH, low carb, low fat, anything can be given. The combination of physical activity and behavioral modification, giving importance on stress reduction. So comparing the weight loss programs around the globe, we find that weight loss is happening with any low carbohydrate or low fat diets, and the so-called individual weight loss programs have very little differences in patients. And the recommendation should be that any dietary intervention we are planning should match the individual's patient needs with appropriate weight loss program. And the general guidance for dieters, the 10 to 35% of calories should come from protein, and 45 to 65% of calories from carbohydrates, and 20 to 30% from fats. But around the globe, we are using low carbohydrate diets, high protein diets, which are hard to follow and are not more effective. But the very important point from this slide is the consumption of less than 10% of calories should be from, the calories should only come from added sugars and saturated fats also. The total calorie consumption should be less than 10%, and the recommendation for sodium is less than 2.3 grams, and this is very important. And the therapeutic lifestyle changes, which is the very effective management of obesity. The points in which we have to look into it is set realistic, individualized, achievable goals for a long-term weight loss rather than a rapid short-term one. 10% of body weight in 4 to 6 months will be a better plan, and set specific behavior goals and communicating and encouraging exercise, because exercise, say the term exercise, people get reluctant to it. And the lifestyle intervention is a vital component of all weight loss regimens. The primary therapeutic goal of obesity management is improvement in adiposity related complications and not a present decline in body weight. And that's why the European Association for the Study of Obesity has coined obesity as an adiposity based chronic disease, that is ABCD. So the better and best way of nutrition intervention in obesity is a balanced diet, because it improves the quality of life, and moving from an energy dense diet to a nutrition dense diet should be followed. My plate approach is also very effective in managing obesity, making half of the daily food choices from fruits and vegetables and 1/4 of daily food choices from whole grains. And to conclude, I would like to say that feeding is a behavior, and what we eat, where we eat, when we eat, everything are all learned behaviors and can be relearned in a very better way.
Thank you, Soumya.
I would also like to thank our sponsors, Abbott Nutrition. And as I already discussed, the meal replacers are very helpful in managing obesity and also in diabetes.
The topics are open for discussion. I request all the speakers to join for the discussion. There are no queries. I think we will wind up the session. Thank you once again for all the speakers, and thank you, Dr. Sabir and team, for the excellent academic event.